to the GAB Talks by the Independent Press Award. I'm your hostess, Gabby Olzak. Today we'll be speaking with author Stephen Procko, who received a 2023 Independent Press Award Distinguished Favorite in History for his book, Rebel Correspondent. Stephen is a documentarian, cinematographer, and history buff. His documentary series, There's History Around Every Bend, led him to the discovery of Private Arba F. Shaw's writings, featured in Rebel Correspondent. Steve's commercial film production company, Steve Procko Productions, has earned 3 Emmys, over 50 Addy Awards, Telly Awards, and 2 Promax Awards. His Emmy Award-winning financial literacy program, Talking Money Minutes, is available on over 100 public television stations nationwide. Also an accomplished fine art photographer, Steve's work has been exhibited at the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, the Museum of Art in Fort Lauderdale, in addition to solo and group exhibitions throughout the United States. Steve shares a mountain log cabin in Georgia and a home in Florida with his wife, Lauren, and their dog, Rigby. Congratulations, Steve, and welcome to the GAB.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Rebel Correspondents, love the book. It's part biography of Private Arba F. Shaw and part historical perspective of the Civil War. So Steve, give us a synopsis of the book.
Well, Rebel Correspondent is a true story about a young man. His name was Arba F. Shaw, and he joined the Confederate 4th Georgia Cavalry a few days after his 18th birthday in October 1862, and then fought in that regiment for more than 2.5 years till the war ended. And along the way, he was seriously wounded twice and suffered life-threatening illnesses that laid him up in a hospital. More than 30 months of his life ticked by as a cavalry private, and he was just one of thousands trying to survive and make it out alive, which he did. And he emerged as a changed person and returned to his life in the valley in the shadow of Lookout Mountain, where his family had a farmstead. But he wasn't just a farmer, he was a writer.
Steve, I have a question for you. I want to know what drew you to Private Shaw's writings in particular. Incidentally, it spans 55 articles, 40,000 words, are written during the period of during 11 weeks, over the span of 11 weeks, and he entitles it "My Experiences in the War of the 1860 Briefly Told." Not so brief. But why not write a book about a well-known figure in the Civil War? Why a very completely unknown fellow who was in the Civil War? Like you said, there were thousands.
Well, Arba was the average soldier, and he was incredibly young. In fact, all of the soldiers, the officers of the regiment and such, were ridiculously young. They were they're teenagers and in their early 20s. And what he wrote was what life was like for the average soldier. He began writing these articles for his local newspaper as a result of the editor of the newspaper. This was the Walker County Messenger in Lafayette, Georgia. And he started writing because that editor had also been a captain in another Georgia cavalry regiment that he traveled with. And so he knew him as an editor and also as a captain. And what really appealed to me was how real the writing was. I mean, this was, as you mentioned, a manuscript of about 40,000 words that he wrote between December of 1901 and February of 1903, and the newspaper began serializing it in their publication first, maybe every 2 weeks, and then it became a weekly thing, ultimately 55 articles. And what was interesting was when I came across this, I was researching for a Civil War documentary on the region in North Georgia, where I have my cabin. And I came across Arba's writings. and it was just a mention of them existing. And so I had to find them. But once I found them, they had a very similar feel to another soldier whose name was Sam Watkins, who lived in Columbia, Tennessee, about 175 miles from where Arba was. And he wrote similarly in 1881 his perspective as a private in the Tennessee infantry. And ultimately, same situation. His writings were serialized in his local newspaper, but then they published it as a book that was titled Company H, and that was AYTCH. It was a limited edition, 2,000 copies. They sold out relatively quickly, and this would be an obscure book, if not the fact that more than 100 years later, Ken Burns featured it and quoted Watkins extensively in his Civil War documentary for PBS. So when I came across Arba's writings, and once I put them all together and it read as a cohesive 40,000 word manuscript, I realized that this had similarities. And it's the kind of history I like to find, which is about that local perspective. It's
The
not
average
about,
fella, your neighbor.
yeah. And it's, this isn't a book about why the war was fought or the
Right.
politics of the war. This is about a soldier's account of what it was like. And,
well, it's interesting. You also you quoted actually Private Shaw in one of his articles, and Private Shaw wrote, this is Private Shaw speaking. Well, actually, you said this about Private Shaw. He likely wrote them by the glow of lantern light at the kitchen table in his farmstead just down the road from today's blinking red light at the intersection known as Cooper Heights. That was actually beautiful when I read that. I sort of got chills up and down my spine. What did that tell us about him?
well, he was, after the war, a returning soldier from the side that lost, who had to sign a loyalty oath to become an American citizen again. And he went on with his life, and as basically a farmer, and married a woman that he actually met while his regiment was marching through this little town, and they had a couple of daughters that survived into adulthood, and then he lost her, and then he married again. And so it's a story of, this story is his story of his experiences during the war, but as an individual, it represented a very interesting perspective on what life was like at the end of the 19th century and what the thinkings were for people like Arba Shaw. He wrote, his style of writing was, I'll go back to Sam Watkins. Sam Watkins, I feel, wrote very similar to Mark Twain.
Right, I read that. Yes.
Whereas Arba Shaw is like Lake Wobegon. It's more homespun and more, they're both interesting ways of writing, but I was definitely attracted to Arba's writing because of that.
Rebel Correspondent is the true story of a young man who joined the Rebel Army at the tender age of 18.
It was a hard task for me to leave a pleasant home where peace and abundant comfort were taken in exchange for a miserable outdoor life where I was liable to be killed any day.
A lowly private, just struggling to survive one of the greatest events in American history.
I had not fired a gun at a man, and I stepped out in the line too. The others went to work. But as for me, what about shooting at a man? After the first shot, my nerves quieted.
The down-to-earth accounts of the everyday life of a young cavalry soldier.
Now we were ready for war, and on the way, I saw the first bloodshed by gunshot. One of the boys in another company, in dismounting, shot himself through the foot.
Soon, it became survival mode.
We were poorly clad, and the winter was so cold that the ice was 21 inches thick on the ponds. I saw lots of Longstreet's men on that frozen ground, barefooted.
He would be wounded twice and emerged from the conflict a changed person.
He had on a red sash. He shot me twice and killed my horse, while I shot 4 times. And he was shot, as could be easily seen. So close were we.
When it was all finished, he returned home to farm in the shadow of Lookout Mountain. But he wasn't just a farmer. He was also a writer. 36 years later, he would tell the world about his experiences in his hometown newspaper. Then it was all but forgotten. Until now. Rebel Correspondent.
Shaw started writing nearly 36 years after the fact. He was 54 years old.
Yes.
Do you think his recollections were distorted at all? Do you think he omitted anything?
Well, that's definitely something that other soldiers writing 20, 30 years after the fact, you could find that.
Mhm.
That was, in fact, one of the things that was interesting about the research I did into this, into his writings and how it became a book. He had so much information about the little things that were going on day to day that I wanted to research it and see how accurate it was. And it came up incredibly accurate.
That's sort of amazing, don't you find?
I did believe that that was really something, that his recollection was excellent, considering that he didn't carry with him a diary and record this stuff,
Right.
So, or for all I know, he may have written things about his experiences that, allowed him to refer to it when he wrote this 40,000 word piece. But yeah, I mean, what's interesting about his account of his time as a private in the Fort Georgia Cavalry is there are a lot of instances where events that were known historically occurred that he's offering a perspective that maybe we hadn't heard before.
Mhm.
Or he's finding or telling the story about the death of somebody in his regiment or people the regiment came across that were not really known to the families as to what happened to their loved one. For all they knew, their loved one went off to war and he never came back. Well, Shaw in many events offers, these up close personal perspectives on these historical events. One, for example, as I mentioned, he had been wounded twice. So the first time he was wounded was in May of 1864 at the Battle of New Hope Church in Georgia. And this is part of the campaign that ultimately resulted in the Battle of Atlanta and Atlanta falling. And he was with his commanding officer, who was a colonel named Isaac Avery. Gentleman was born in St. Augustine. He was an attorney in Savannah before the war. And Shaw and him were at the Battle of New Hope Church in the early part of the battle. And he witnessed Colonel Avery being what they thought at the time mortally wounded. He was shot in the stomach. The bullet lodged near his spine. And basically they thought he was a dead man. And, they called it a grave injury when they described it on the battlefield. Shaw himself was wounded shortly afterwards. He had a shot to the thigh, and both men rode away in an ambulance to Marietta and ultimately to hospitals in Atlanta. And that's told in Shaw's account. Now, the colonel survived, and that little tidbit of information about what happened after he had shot, I've not found anywhere. He actually went on to be one of the founders and first editors of the Atlanta Constitution,
Wow.
Colonel Avery. And he lived until the 1890s, but always was on crutches. It affected his ability to walk and move for the rest of his life.
That's incredible. So, as you mentioned, Shaw was 18 years old when he enlisted, and through his writings, you can see how seriously he took it, almost as his responsibility to recount the events, as you just said. He's the one who provided the historical perspective when there wasn't any other. And he actually wrote, "Older men than I could possibly tell about the happenings of the raid a great deal better, as I was only a wayward lad of 19 years. But what they would tell would be their part. They can't write up my experiences, nor me theirs." So what was he saying there?
Well, I think that's exactly it. In fact, Avery wrote kind of a pretty impressive book himself after the war, dealing with some parts of the war. But Arba wrote about his life day to day as a soldier, as a private, and the difficulties that they all experienced. And yeah, I believe he was accurate in saying that his perspective is his perspective, no one else's.
No one else's.
Yeah, yeah.
You talk about seeing the elephant, the expression "seeing the elephant." What does that mean, and what's the significance of the expression in relation to Shaw?
Well, that's a well-known term for Civil War, for soldiers in the Civil War. Excuse me. And it relates to probably what Arba felt when he first enlisted. It was an exciting thing. I'm going somewhere. He was a farmer in a little valley in northwestern Georgia, and suddenly he's going off for the first time. He'd never gone off and experienced the world, and so that was where that term came from. But it also meant going into battle. You're going into battle and experiencing horrible things. And so the soldiers that went off and experienced that came back different, just like soldiers of today. And there was, I'm sure, PTSD within the ranks of the soldiers that came back.
How did Shaw come? How did it change Shaw?
He seemed to come back pretty much the same way he was when he left. I mean,
it seemed that way through his meetings.
I mean, he went through being wounded twice, and he also had what seemed to be typhoid, and that affected him. He ended up having to go home for a couple of months and recuperate, lost a lot of weight, and then came back to the battle. So I think because he had these, times when he was away and dealing with injuries, it maybe, I'm sure that affected him afterwards. I know that his writing hand, his right arm, was affected, and psychologically, I can't imagine that he went through the experiences that he went through without it having some psychological impact as well.
Of course.
What those were, though, he didn't really express. There wasn't that angst about what had occurred in his life for those years that came out in his writings.
I mean, he definitely painted a true picture of the harsh realities of the war, but it as you said, it didn't seem to really resonate with him too personally, particularly. He just was recounting them, actually.
Right.
I mean, that was my opinion after reading that. I mean, he even talks about the first time he killed another soldier. But then he seemed to quickly acclimate to his new role as soldier and in his life as being a soldier.
And I think every soldier had to go through what he said when he talked about, could I pull that trigger? I think that's part of being human, being a human being, and being put in a situation where you're firing your weapon at another human being. And
of course.
And so that particular point that he made, I thought was telling. It affected him. Yes.
Right. But he did acclimate to it pretty quickly. He thought, okay, well, this is my new station in life. This is what I have to do.
And he had to survive.
He had to survive. Exactly. It was either he
They
shoots
were
them, or they shoot him.
They were firing back at him. Absolutely.
Right. So Steve, you warn your readers that some accounts of enslaved people were pretty vile. In fact, you say that some of the stories were, in fact, cringeworthy and racist. Alba wrote his articles 35 years after the war. It was during 1901. It was a different time, but was it? What was different and what was similar about it?
Well, I mean, he was in the South, post Civil War. He was living in the Jim Crow South.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't go into detail about that, and even in the other writings, because he was writing for his local newspaper as a correspondent, he doesn't really talk one way or the other. I don't see, a tremendous amount of racism in anything that he was writing. He was, as a soldier, moving through areas that had enslaved people.
Right, of course.
And the, his feelings of that aren't really expressed.
He wrote as a journalist, almost impartial, didn't he?
He did, but I also think that, the soldiers that went off to war, a lot of them really didn't have a dog in the hunt of why the war was going on. They were fighting because it was more of a, their state was under siege. It was being, attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And so without that, he came from a farm where, his father was a primitive Baptist minister, and would travel a circuit on the weekends and do this farming during the week. Arba was the oldest of the children in that family. And so they lived on that farm providing for themselves. What they raised fed them. They would sell their goods to the market to raise money, but they did not own anybody to help them raise what they were producing on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my experience in researching the whole region was, that was the case, especially in the mountains of North Georgia. The central part of North Georgia, where I have my cabin, there were no major battles there at all, but there was chaos because there was infighting between people that favored the Union side and people that favored the Southern Confederate side.
Yeah.
And that chaos in the mountains is a whole nother story. In fact, it was the documentary that I'm still working on that Arba's story came from.
Yeah, I want to get to that. So during your research, you said you contacted Shaw's family.
Yeah, I've reached out to anybody I could find. I did.
Yeah, I bet.
I did locate a couple of his great grandsons.
And how did they react?
Well, it's interesting because they were aware of him.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, when I met them, we met them at the graveyard where he's buried, and they had never been there.
Really?
And they live right there.
Really?
Yeah.
And you also said there are no photos of him. That's really strange.
Well, that is the ongoing, search. I continue to look for something. Through the entire writing of the book, I could not find a picture. That was a question I asked of every descendant I talked to. They only were vaguely aware that he had written for the Walker County Messenger. And we couldn't find anything. And then towards the very end, when the manuscript was finished, we were in the editing and proofreading process. I came across a picture that was actually published in the Walker County Messenger. I'm going to say 1906, 7, 8, somewhere in that time frame. And it was him and his wife. And obviously it's a newspaper reproduction, so it's not that great. Nobody actually has that original photograph. And it looks like it was a picture taken, honestly, on an anniversary, a wedding anniversary date, which would have been like maybe their 20th or 25th wedding anniversary, in and around that time. So that picture had to have existed with the family even after he died.
Right.
And but yet nobody had it. So that was the only picture we were able to actually put into the book that was, hey, I know for a fact this is Arba. And in fact, the cover itself came from a composition that I did using unidentified Confederate soldiers that were cavalry privates, and we created that composite. So the uniform is relatively accurate to cavalry soldiers' private's uniform. The face was, I was looking for the youngest soldier that I could find. And actually, if you look on the cover, there's a little interesting little thing in the bottom right where his left hand is holding a pen and his right is holding a sword. So there's that analogy of the pen.
Have to take a look at that. So that's got to be frustrating that you really don't have photos because you're working on a documentary.
Well, that's true.
And, so how does that work?
Well, the story is still going to be the story of what the Fort Georgia.
Of course.
So I think that it will work its way out.
I'm excited to see that. That sounds like it's going to be really amazing. So tell us about your second book, Captured Freedom, and when can we read it?
Well, the second book is finished, and it's currently.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's currently with the editor.
Okay.
Going to be out in a few months. It's another true Civil War story. It's another one of those there's history around every bend type of things.
Captured Freedom is the true Civil War story of Union POW officers who escaped from a Southern prison.
Some fellow would make a run right through the line, expecting that before the guard could recover his gun and shoot with any certainty, he'd be too far away to be hit.
For those who made it, rebel search parties with dogs were on their trail. Captured Freedom is an epic story of survival.
At night, we plunged forward in water up to our knees and rested in trees during the day.
When they finally made it to the mountains, they found harsh winter weather conditions.
We traveled through snow and ice, almost frozen, unable to start a fire for fear of discovery by rebel scouts.
They were officers in Union regiments from across the country. Before they were captured, they had seen action in most all of the major battles of the Civil War. As POWs, they survived impossible conditions in rebel prisons throughout the South.
For 7 long, dreary months, I had been in prison. Our food was wretched. It seems a horrible dream.
After they each escaped, it took them over a month to make it more than 350 miles before crossing over Union lines. Then they caught a train to Knoxville, where they sought out a photographer and posed together for a photograph. A Civil War selfie. It was a moment that captured freedom. They say every picture tells a story. This one tells many.
So you're hooked now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the story of a group of Union officers who were POWs of the Confederate Army. And the group escaped from a prison called Camp Sorghum in Columbia, South Carolina in November 1864. And they walked over 350 miles to Union lines, eventually making it to Knoxville on New Year's Day, 1865. And when they got there, after they checked in, they decided to go and have a photograph of their group made. So it was kind of like a Civil War selfie.
Wow.
And I feel that it was a moment that captured freedom. And so this book is an epic Civil War story, or the complete story of all of these soldiers. And it came to me at the time I was finishing Rebel Correspondent, when a neighbor over the mountain from where I live, we were discussing things in a Facebook group on this, Civil War group. And he instant messaged me this photograph. And
Wow.
this is the photograph that was taken.
And that's the selfie.
That's the selfie.
Wow.
Different men. So these officers were from regiments all over the North, from Iowa to New Jersey. And they had experienced all the different battles. And 2 had fought at Gettysburg, 3 were in the Battle of Chattanooga. 1 made it through the siege of Vicksburg, only to be captured a week later at Jackson, Mississippi. 1 escaped through the tunnel at Libby Prison as a POW, which was like the great escape of the Civil War. And he was recaptured 3 days later. 1 led a company of black soldiers into the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg in Virginia. And then he was captured and had to talk his way out of what potentially would have been his own execution.
Wow.
3 of them jumped off a prison train to escape, only to be recaptured. Many of them were wounded in battle. Some were reported as killed in action to their loved ones, and it took months before they discovered that they were alive. And, one of the men in this picture was dead 10 months after posing for it, because he never recovered from the effects of being in prison.
PTSD.
Yeah. In this picture, there are 3 North Carolina mountain guides that help the Union escapees get through the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. One of them is only 14 years old. And
14 years old.
Right. So 2 years ago, a descendant shared this photo with me. And I said, would you mind if I research it a little bit? And once I got into it, I realized what a great story it was. And it just became this epic cinematic Civil War adventure. And you know what? They say that every picture tells a story. And
I was just going to say that. Yes.
This one tells many.
So was there any one particular story that stood out that will inspire you to write a 3rd book just focused on that soldier?
Not really, because
Okay.
the book itself tells the story of all of these
Mhm.
men. I don't think there's another book in there. There's some interesting things that occur in the book where I triangulate the research around other people's accounts. So I came across another diary of a soldier that was in the Signal Corps, which was really kind of like not the Secret Service, but these were the guys that were the spies,
Mhm.
and he was involved in a raid attempt from General Kirkpatrick, who was coming from up around Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, it was Kilpatrick, coming from around Washington, D.C., charging with 4,000 cavalry soldiers down to Richmond in an attempt to free these prisoners of war that were held in Libby Prison. And these men that I just showed you the picture of, some of them were there. The Signal Corps officer was in that raid and had some very interesting things to say in his writing. So that's a potential for a book.
Okay.
But I've been on a Civil War tear here for 2 books.
I can see that.
I don't know if I seriously think that that's where the next book will go, because there's other options.
So what is next? I know you're planning to develop documentaries about the Rebel Correspondent and Captured Freedom. Is that correct?
No, I don't think Captured Freedom I want to do the documentary of. It's too big of a story. I'd love to have somebody acquire the rights and make something of it.
Okay.
That would be a great goal. Rebel Correspondent to me is a natural documentary, like an hour long, since the story is so Georgia centric, and really it relates to Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia. That's really where, and a little bit of Alabama. That's where Arba was. To me, it's a natural for public television as like an hour long.
For sure. I agree.
So
So what's next then?
Well, that's probably where I'll go next. Although with Captured Freedom just coming out this summer, I'm going to be putting a lot of energies into talking about that too.
For sure. Well, I hope we get to talk to you about that. I'm looking forward to it. So Steve, you're a documentarian and a cinematographer. What is your favorite movie?
Oh boy.
Weren't expecting that one.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a favorite. I can say that in writing Captured Freedom, that Laura Hillenbrandt's Unbroken was an inspiration in the approach of the writing style.
Okay.
Right. It's narrative nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say as a movie, I particularly like that movie, which was out just in the last 5 or 6 years, I guess.
Yeah, that was fantastic. So was the book, by the way. So was the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this is great. Steve, we really enjoyed it. My mom is a huge Civil War buff. I can't wait to pass along the books to her, and it was really fascinating read. How can readers find out more about you and Rebel Correspondent?
Well, Rebel Correspondent has its own website, which is rebelcorrespondent.com.
Easy enough.
Yeah. And Captured Freedom, the same way, capturedfreedom.com. So you can go to one and find out about the other and vice versa. And there is historybend.org, which is where all these little documentaries and other little stories will kind of find a place.
Fantastic. And where can folks see your documentary, History Around the Bend?
Well, that's historybend.org has these little documentaries. I call them micro documentaries because they deal with little stories in different places that, North Georgia mountains say. And so the links are there at that particular website to these little micro documentaries.
Look forward to it. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. Hope we get to talk to you about Captured Freedom. Look forward to reading it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next time on the GAB Talks, we will speak with M. Timothy Murray, author of Prelude to War. This is your hostess, Gabby Olzak. Until we meet again, keep on reading.